So, nightlifers, are you familiar with zines? They're kind of cottage magazines, tiny bespoke publications that might even be made using the photocopier or by hand, often very niche in their topic. But the zine scene is flourishing here in Australia. So, we've got to learn a bit more about them tonight and how the whole scene works. And my guest is Vanessa Berry, who says that zines changed her life. She's been publishing her own zine called I Am a Camera since 2000, and she's here now. Vanessa, I guess that makes it your 25th anniversary.
Well, actually, I'm approaching my 30-year zine-anniversary, which will be next year because I made my first zine in 1996.
Okay, take us back there. What was it all about?
Well, maybe I'll start by describing what zines are because they are, I mean, even though I've been making them for so long, they've remained over that time a fairly secretive or perhaps hidden creative subculture. So a zine, the easiest way to describe one is a photocopied personal magazine. Can have writing or art in it. They're usually some kind of booklet. Like if you're struggling to think of what this might look like think of a small booklet with some kind of writing or art inside. They're DIY productions. They're made, printed, and distributed by their creators. They might have one creator or multiple people might be involved. But they certainly have kept me busy for the last almost 3 decades, and I really love making them.
Yeah.
Now, I started in the 1990s when I was a teenager, and that's when I discovered them.
So, how did you come across your first zines then?
Well, to take us back, so I think it's the 1990s. No or limited internet. I was a big fan of music. I would go into city music stores from the suburbs of Sydney where I lived, firstly to listen to music or browse the CDs. But I also discovered in these music stores, so these were shops like Red Eye and Waterfront and Phantom Records, for those who remember Sydney of the time. You'll possibly remember those places. They also had these photocopied magazines there. Some of them were about music, or most of them were about music, but there were also ones where people wrote about their lives, and they were just really fascinating to me. They were for sale for $1 or $2. So they're very accessible, and they just interested me that people made them because they were passionate about whatever was inside. So there were lots of zines, about music, and I was interested in those, but I was also interested in the more unusual ones. There was a few that I would regularly pick up that were actually American zines, so they must have come in
Wow.
it must have come in through a distributor, I guess, with records. There was one called Thrift Score, which was about op shops or thrift stores, as they're known in the US, and about all the kinds of objects you might find in those. And I was a big op shopper, and in fact still am. So that really spoke to me. But it wasn't like a glossy magazine. It was one person's personal take on op shopping and the kinds of objects she would find. And I just found them really interesting. And they were different, diverse voices in a time when media was pretty mainstream. There wasn't the huge range that we have now.
So, Vanessa, just if you could take a bit of the history, because it sounds like magazine, but I think it actually, the term comes from a fanzine. What was a fanzine?
Fanzines have been around for, around a century now. So they started in the 1930s when people made fan publications related to science fiction. So they might have art or stories that were sci-fi art or stories, and like classifieds in them where people might write if they were collecting something or if they wanted contributions to their own fanzine. So it very much started with fan culture, which of course we still have today. And back then it was science fiction. Then later in 1960s, 1970s, they became more music aligned, and particularly in the 1970s, when punk arose, the form of the fanzine, so the very kind of rough and ready, Xeroxed look of them aligned with the aesthetics of punk. So there were plenty of punk zines that were made, and underground music scenes as well. So it was people making publications from, rather than being the experts writing in the music magazines or the critics writing from outside the scene, there were people who were involved in those music scenes, reporting from the inside, perhaps. And then in the 1990s, with the Riot Girl movement, which started in the US, it was a punk feminist movement, zines turned, well, they're still about music, but they turned to be more autobiographical, and people wrote stories from their everyday lives. That's where I met up with them. There was still a lot of the kind of music fanzines, but there were also these more personal zines. And of course, there's also traditions of comics as well, things like poetry chapbooks. So there's all sorts of aligned things, but the main trajectory for the history of zines as we know them today is through that fan and fanzine route.
Vanessa Berry is with me, a writer and artist, author of 2 books, and the zine I Am a Camera, which she's been publishing since 2000, although she was telling us her first zine she made back in the 90s. So what made you decide this is what I want to do? Let me get my hands at making my own zine.
Well, I'd been reading them for a few years, and I didn't quite feel like I was the kind of person who was, well, let's say, cool enough to make a zine. I was a little teenager from the suburbs. But I started to read zines or find zines that were made by people like me, so people who were teenagers who lived fairly unexceptional lives, but had an interesting take on it, or just felt like sharing whatever they wanted to share with the world. So when I read zines that were more like by people like me, I felt empowered to make my own. I'd always been a creative person and drawn to writing and art, and I loved writing letters. Another way to think about zines is they are a bit like a letter to the world. That's one of the ways I like to think of them, or at least for mine anyway, which have a lot of writing in them. So it was being empowered because I saw other people like me doing it. And I think that's still why people are connected to zines today. They see people who are like them or don't seem to have special qualifications or a kind of a special level of skill having a go, and they think, all right, I might try this too. That was certainly the case for me back then. And I mean, I think I would be surprised if somebody had a time machine, or if I had a time machine and went back and talked to my younger self and said, do you know that you will be on the radio talking about the history of zines in 2025? But I really love them, and they've been a major positive creative force in my life for sure.
So Vanessa, I mean, it sounds like a joy to create, but how important is it to find an audience? Because I'd imagine that some of these may not see much of an audience.
Well, there's a strong zine community. It's a fairly small community, but it's a very passionate community. And when I started making zines in the 1990s, so the first zine that I made, I put for free in music stores. So there was an area where they had flyers for, I feel like I'm describing another world, flyers for shows coming up and free zine. So I just put my zine there. I did have a friend with a post office box, so I put the post office box in there for my contact details. I didn't really expect anybody to write to me, but people started to write to me and say they liked my zine and sent me theirs. And so immediately I was part of this community, and I found that to be, well, it was such a surprise, but it was so encouraging, and I loved being suddenly part of this creative community. And that community focus has remained the whole time I've been making zines. And it's a strong community, and so there are opportunities to share your zines through things like zine fairs or zine fests. So these are like markets where people set up a table with their zines and, sell them or trade them. But they're like community events where people get together and, just see what each other is making and browse other zines. So these happen quite often and they happen all around the country. There's one coming up in Sydney in August, Other Worlds, which is the biggest zine fair in Sydney. That's on August 2nd, but there's many. So if this interests you, if you look up what zine activities are happening in your local area, there may yet be something.
So it's mainly the other zine creators who are reading your zines. It's kind of like a community where you're reading each other's work. That be fair?
I mean, they do. Yes, sorry.
I'll just say, would that be a fair summary of the situation when it comes to who's reading them?
Yeah, I mean, I also have a profile as a writer, so maybe my zines extend a little bit beyond, but in general, it's people who are involved in the community. I mean, as you say, they're not widely known, even though they've been around for a long time. So people in the zine community or in aligned community, so I'd say the literary world or the art world, they're popular and prevalent in visual arts as well, or comics. So they overlap these other creative communities. So I'd say the readership does extend a bit beyond just the zine community, but in general, yes, that's where you would go to find them and also where you find most zine readers.
Yeah. Now, what if some of our listeners, though, are thinking, oh, I'd like to check out one of these zines. Do local libraries stock them at all?
Some do, yes. So state libraries do. So the State Library of Victoria or State Library of New South Wales and maybe other ones as well. Some local libraries do. So I know in Sydney, the City of Sydney Library has a zine collection, for example. So it's worth just asking and checking out to see if libraries have them. They do pose a bit of a challenge for libraries to collect because they are, well, I guess they're fragile compared to a book when you're thinking it's a photocopied pamphlet. They also don't neatly conform to cataloguing, but all of these are not unsurmountable problems. And some libraries do indeed have collections that you can either go in and browse or you can request to look at.
Yeah. Vanessa Berry is with me, a writer, an artist, author of 2 books and the zine I Am a Camera. So tell us about I Am a Camera. What's your zine all about, or does it change, from publication to publication?
It's an autobiographical zine or a personal zine. So I write about my life and whatever has happened in that year. So it varies. It depends what the year brings. When I started making it, I didn't actually make it regularly, but it's settled to being once a year, and neatly the year matches up with the issue. So I'm actually writing number 25 now, hopefully to debut at this Otherworld Zine Fair in a few months' time. So stories from my life. And so, for example, a couple of years ago, I went on a trip to Poland. I'm an academic. Teach creative writing and lecture in creative writing, and I was there for a conference, but I didn't write about the conference. I wrote about this mission I made to go to an intriguing antique store. So that was number 23. Number 24 was a sadder one. My father passed away last year, and I went to his apartment and was packing up all his things after he passed away, and so I wrote about that experience. So often they can be quite personal stories, and perhaps that goes with their smaller print run, and they are a kind of more intimate way of communicating with people.
And Vanessa, in your case, I mean, is it literally you write it up and you chuck it on the photocopier? Is that what you do with yours?
I do photocopy them. I mean, I'm fairly old school, and not all zine makers are perhaps so analog as me, but most of them are photocopied. So if you go to a zine fair, the vast majority of them will be photocopied or maybe copied on a home printer, but really most of them will be photocopied. And it's important to say it does. So there are digital zines, but it's really a print medium, or it's very much a print culture of physical objects.
Yeah. Now, Vanessa, you were saying you were selling yours for first for free and, sometimes for $1 or something. But do you pay for other people's zines or do you kind of share them around?
Both. Well, so at a zine fair, people do sell them. They're usually fairly cheap, so under $10. Or so mine, I am a cameras, for example, would be about $5 to $10. I make other smaller zines too that are cheaper, but there's a culture of like a gift economy, I guess. Zines are often traded, so I will trade my zine for other people's at these kinds of events, or other zine makers who I've known for many years. We will just give each other our zines when we make them. So we have this kind of exchange that we do regularly. So yes, they're sold, but they're not really, they're not made for a profit, and it's really more about the sharing of your creative work.
Yeah. Now, I know there's a shop, I think, Sticky in Melbourne, that's quite a famous zine store. Are the zines tucked in amongst other things, or is it all about zines at Sticky?
All zines, 100% zines. So that store's been going since 2001. It's a pretty amazing place, and I recommend anyone who's in or going to Melbourne to check it out. So they just sell zines, and they also have a zine fair every February called the Festival of the Photocopier, which is a 2-day zine fair.
How fantastic. Now, your latest book is called Calendar. That's coming out later this year. What's the connection with I Am a Camera? Is there one?
There is. So Calendar's my 5th book. I didn't want to interrupt, but I have.
Oh, I see. We've undersold you. Vanessa Berry, writer and artist, author of 4 books with one more coming, and a zine.
Yeah. So Calendar's my 5th book, and it's a yearbook, and so that means that there's a story for every day of the year. It's an autobiographical story that is about a different object for every day of the year. And so the way that I write in it is very much based on the way I write in I Am a Camera, which is looking at kind of what's to hand or what's happening in the moment. The way I wrote the book was every day, so I wrote it in 2022, every day I waited for some kind of object to get my attention, and then every night I would write about it. So I kind of wrote it in real time, and that real-time way of writing is certainly something I've developed through my zines.
Oh, tell us about some of the objects in the book.
Well, there's all sorts of things. I love retro objects. So there's various things like an anodized apple ice bucket. I've wrote about a hot water bottle in the depths of winter. What else? Oh, I always go blank, but thankfully I have the cover here, which I'm looking at, a second place rosette that I won when I was a child and have held onto. I was never one for really winning many things. A big aluminium teapot, a 4-leaf clover, a car air freshener, a watering can, a Halloween pumpkin. So there's 365 of these.
How important do you think, Vanessa, that experience you had writing zines was in your writing career? Where does it sit in?
I don't know that I would be a writer if I hadn't started making zines. I've always been a creative person, but I didn't really realise I had an aptitude for writing until I started making zines, and I heard back from other people who said they enjoyed my writing, and I thought about it as something that I did have an aptitude for. So they really got me into writing in the first place. It's been a space for me to experiment too and try out different kinds of writing. So I've settled on writing in this autobiographical way or life writing. But I've tried out all sorts of different kinds of writing in my zines. And it's also just been where I've practiced my writing and felt very free to experiment with it.
Well, Vanessa, thank you for giving us this insight into the world of zines tonight.
Oh, thanks, Suzanne. Hopefully it was an interesting journey and maybe some listeners are inspired to find out a bit more about zines now.
Well, that's right, Nightlife, as you could create your own. Vanessa, thanks again. There's Vanessa Berry, writer, artist, author of 4 books with one more coming, and the zine I Am a Camera, which she's been publishing since the year 2000.